My name is Ashok Mathur. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies and Interim VP of Research here at OCAD University. I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement and then talk about a couple of details before throwing it over to the panel. As folks know from who've attended these before for contingencies of care, these tend to be driven by panelists, informal, much what you'd see when you're doing a residence. So it's less of a speaker series, I suppose, than something that's intended to be dynamic and engaged. So so I won't go with any formal introductions. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll throw it then to the panel to speak to their own histories and their connections and such. I do want to acknowledge too that this particular event comes from the Toronto Biennial of Art. Other events we're having come through York, come through Emily Carr, and come through UBC Okanagan and its Indigenous Intensive as well. So it's a nice conglomerate of many events coming together. We are here in, those of us in Toronto, we are here on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, as well as the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I mention that because that's part of our official land acknowledgement at OCAD, but I also recognize different universities in the area, different institutions do recognize communities differently. And to that end, I also acknowledge that in Toronto, the Metro of Toronto, it's the fourth largest population of the urban Indigenous population in the country, and it's also home to Métis communities as well, and many other spaces and places that are worthy of acknowledgement. And I'd urge all of us in the room to just reflect in a moment on our own land bases that we're at. Some of us are not in this particular space, and to hear what's happening and think about what's happening in those histories. I'd also just like to note, and I'll put this out on our Discord site and others, that this Thursday, led by two of our strong the Indigenous the advisor to the Indigenous Provost to the Provost of Indigenous Issues, Peter Moore and Nadia McLaren, who works with the Faculty of Art, will be doing a vigil on Thursday at 2:15 p.m. EST, and this will be in commemoration of the 215, the remains of the 215 children found in Kamloops by the residential school. So I'll put that information out and urge people to see that. Finally, just a shout out to this RRA team that's been pretty amazing, both at OCAD and at Emily Carr. They're the ones who are facilitating, constructing, and making all this stuff. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to the panel. It's called Care, Cure, and Curate, and it's a 3-person panel. And I'm going to just throw it over to whoever would like to pick up on this, introducing themselves, and letting us know what the process is. And I'm going to take a back seat and be really, really excited to see what's happening here. Over to the panel.
Thank you, Ashok. I appreciate it. My name is Chiedza Pasipanodya, and I'm just going to, before moving forward, also do an ancestral African libation, just to open up the space as we typically do. So in order to do the libation, we typically do it with water in the space, and water being a universal symbol of life and connection. So during the libation, I will call out the names of my ancestors and the ancestors whose names need to be called at this time. And I invite you all to do the same as well. And so to unmute yourselves and call out the names if you feel led to. And as this is done, we call out the names just so that we acknowledge that the person is not truly gone until we stop saying their names. So as I pour, I invite you to call the names, and we will continue after that. So my name is Chiedza Natasha Pasipanodya. I call on the names of all my ancestors who have come and gone before. I invite you into this space to gather with us, to celebrate with us, to connect with us, and to ground this space. I pour and acknowledge the energies of the north, the south, the east, and the west. And after each, I will say Ashe, which means and so it is. So we say Ashe. I pour and acknowledge the land that I stand on as a person of African descent. I give thanks and I say Ashe. Ashe. And I pour the name of Sophia Manika and Sydney Kurai, Ashe. And I invite you to say the names of your ancestors or anybody whose name you want to call and bring their energy into this space for this time that we're gathering together. Feel free to unmute yourselves. And if you're saying it all at once, that's quite all right as well. Winishola, Ashe,
Mary Smith,
Ashe,
Leopold Smith,
Ashe,
Blanche, and Mitchell.
Ashe, Sydney Kurai, Ashe. Ashe. And we pour for the names that are said and the names that are not said and the names that are held in our hearts. We pour for the missing and murdered Indigenous women on this land. We pour and we say Ashe. We pour for the ancestors that made it across the Atlantic and those that did not and are in the waters. We say Ashe. We pour for all those that are moving through struggles. We say Ashe. And for the names that we've said, the names known and unknown, we say drink and quench your thirst. We welcome you into this space as we gather. We say Ashe. We clap and we welcome them. Thank you. And I'm going to put this aside, and usually at the end, we would have the youngest person in the room pour the water into the earth, but we are in virtual spaces, so I will do that after we close. Thank you. So welcome to Care, Curate, a conversation on curatorial methodologies embedded in care. My name is Chiedza Pasipanodya. I am an artist, a curator, and an educator living in Toronto. I was born and raised in Harare, Zimbabwe, and this deeply impacts my work and my research interests surrounding issues of representation, visual culture, and belonging. Over the last 10 years, I've worked in BIPOC and LGBTQ spaces, such as founding an interfaith arts-based organization called Sunset Service that was really rooted in affirmation, celebration, and anchored in hybrid African spiritual practices, to presenting exhibitions and community-based projects with Manifesto Toronto, the 519, the Feminist Art Gallery, NIA Center for the Arts, and currently right now doing my fellowship with the Toronto Biennial of Art. In my current research and creative practice, I'm continually interested in presencing what's been subtly or violently disappeared, while contributing to a continuum of work that seeks to elevate histories, figures, and folks who might otherwise be forgotten and misremembered. So I'd like to now introduce the panelists and curators. I'll start with Myung-Sun Kim. So Myung-Sun Kim is an artist and curator born in South Korea and currently based in Toronto. She approaches public engagement using intersectional frameworks, methodologies of empathy, care, and generosity, and engaging in civic conversations. She has led curatorial programming at galleries and festivals, including Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival, Inside Out Film Festival Shorts, and the Theatre Centre, and currently at the Toronto Biennial of Art as a curator, public programming, and learning. She has an upcoming exhibition at the Art Gallery of Burlington in September 2021, Vessels, as well as a curatorial project at the Agnes Etherington Art Center in 2022. Thanks, Myung-Sun. And next we have Julia Paoli, who is a curator based in Toronto, where she's currently director and curator at Mercer Union, a contemporary center of art. She provides leadership for the center's mandate to support the production of new and experimental work, assisting artists to realize pivotal projects. Prior to joining Mercer in 2017, Julia held the position of associate curator at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery. She's also contributed to programming to organizations including the Feminist Art Gallery, Gallery TPW, Pleasure Dome, Trinity Square Video, and V-Tape. In 2011, Julia received her MA from the Center of Curatorial Studies at Bard College. Welcome, Julia. So formal, but hello. Geneviève Wallen. Geneviève Wallen is a Tiotiake Muni.
Oh wait, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's like super long. My bio is like so long.
You want me
So
to read the first half?
You can just like read the first half.
I got you.
I was so enthusiastic about like doing something creative, and I'm like, I actually don't know how to do that. So
I will read the first half.
First half.
I got you. And Takaranto, Toronto-based independent curator, writer, and researcher. Wallen's practice is informed by diasporic narratives, intersectional feminism, intergenerational dialogues, BIPOC alternative healing platforms functioning outside neoliberal definitions of self-care and collective care. Her ongoing research focuses on the intersections of longevity and pleasure as contemplative spaces for care and work in the arts, There we go. All right, thank you for that. All right, so I wanted to start off by just framing this conversation, and then we will have our guests present and offer some provocations, and then we will kind of dive into the central question that we're hoping to explore a little bit further around how curatorial methodologies embedded in care might contribute to creating a healthier society in these times. So to frame the conversation, once again, welcome to Care, Curate, Care, Cure, and Curate, a conversation on curatorial methodologies embedded in care. So according to definition, methodology is a contextual framework for research, a coherent and logical scheme based on views, beliefs, and values that guides the choices for researchers to make. Methodologies are predominantly discussed in academic settings, and for many artists, curators, curators and such, the discussions of these contextual frameworks are rarely taken up in these kinds of ways, while in academic spaces, open conversations of one's curatorial methodologies or systems of methods are often obscured or just kind of held closely and held privately. And so we were interested in having this conversation and having it be open and sharing kind of what our processes have been and what the foundations of our work have been as a way of sharing and collectivity. And so it was kind of fun, even in our creation of this presentation, that for ourselves, we were like, do I have a methodology? What does that look like? And of course we do. So that was the fun part of also this process, was discovering and getting to know our own personal methodologies through this particular lens. For me, this pursuit and this engagement with methodologies began in my thesis year at OCADU's Criticism and Curatorial Practices program, where I worked on my thesis, New Perspectives on Black Women Artists in Canada Participating in the Arts, which really sought to provide new insights to the issues of representation for marginalized artists and to think and reframe while we're in a place of seeming forward momentum, which required a number of methodological frameworks to be able to pin down the conversation and to speak towards the lineages of work that's already been done. It's now also resurfaced as I enter into this fellowship with the biennial that'll culminate in an exhibition and presentation of my research in March 2022. And so why this conversation, why now? From my mentors and colleagues, I've been asked at the beginning of this fellowship, really, what kind of curator do I want to be? What is my personal protocol? What are the ways in which I approach the curatorial, which have been invaluable questions. And there are things that I'm still in the process of discovering. And so as we have this conversation, it's going to contribute to part of my own personal learning. And I can already start to see some of the edges of my own curatorial methodologies involving listening, care, embodiment, and community and collectivity. So from this place, I wanted to use this conversation as a way to learn with these three curators whose practices I've found to be engaged with notions of care in really deep and thoughtful ways. From Julie's leadership with assisting artists to realizing their pivotal projects at this artist-run center called Mercer, to the ways that Myung-Sun's public engagement occurs, especially with the intersectional frameworks, and how Genevieve's ongoing research looks at the intersections of longevity and pleasure as contemplative spaces, which is just so thrilling to me, and I can't wait to dive into it. So the title for this, for today, comes from what many curators have already probably heard, the etymological roots of the word curate, which include the late 14th century medieval word curatus, from cura, one responsible for the care, in brackets, of souls, but also for cure, so this caring as a way of curing. However, with these roots of care and cure that seem important now more than ever as we face a time of reckoning and unearthing of colonial violences, particularly on Black and Indigenous bodies across the globe. And so they seemed like the best words to sit and allow us to ground some of the questions that we wanted to explore, and to sort of direct us into what's possible for the curatorial. So at the opening address of this residency for the contingencies of care on June 1st, there were some really interesting provocations that arose from the organizing team that I also thought would be really valuable for today. Some of them were, for example, how do we care for each other? How do we care for our ancestors, our past, as well as our futures, which was brought up by Ashok. And Peter Morin spoke of how care also means a practice of loving. And I thought that was really incredible to bring that into the world of the curatorial. And then Steve Lamb also asked, how can institutions create organized structures of forgetting, and how care is caring for creating new relationships, but also refusing to reproduce the violences that limit care. So those are some of the other anchors and provocations that arose for me. For myself, I arrived at my practice through a desire to say more with the work that I was doing at the time, without necessarily making the work. So while I had an art practice, also the curatorial arrived for me in that way. And now looking back, I kind of see that I was also really interested in space, and in between spaces, and what was happening, particularly when one or more artworks were put together in relationship with each other, and what became possible. So in my undergraduate years, it was visits to the AGO with professors like Andrea Fatona, or to the Art Museum of U of T with Joanna Householder, who often would invite us to notice the spaces in between, to notice not only the works on the wall, but the actual systems that were running the institutions, the people in the institutions, the corners, the molding, all of these details and how they actually played into how we experienced the work. And so in this way, I developed a practice also of listening, and listening beyond what was in front of me, and learning how to cultivate that over time. Some foundational texts and ideas that are also important to mention were, there's an initial exhibition that I had spoken to the group about earlier, and it was an exhibition called Voodoo that was curated by Mauro Parasini at the Canadian Museum of History in 2012. And it was an exhibition that featured voodoo history and culture based in Haiti, but it was presented in such a way that it was animated, the objects weren't in vitrines, and it really offered an opportunity to retell the story of a practice, a cultural practice where voodoo practitioners were seen not just as these shamanistic healers, but as integral members of a society and equivalent to doctors where they are. Another exhibition that was really important for me around that time was 28 Days Reimagining Black History Month. That was curated by Pamela Edmonds and Sally Frater at the Justina M. Barnick Gallery, again in 2012. For me, that exhibition was really groundbreaking in the ways that they were able to tell the story of Black History Month beyond what had come before, but actually creating new futures. And at that time, I hadn't seen anything that was creating, again, these new narratives and possibilities to live into. And the Afrofuturist movement was just becoming quite popular then too. So it was a whole new world building and a whole new possibility happening through exhibition making and space. And then two texts that stand out for me as well around these ideas of methodology and foundations for my methodology were a text by Mary Jane Jacobs. And in this text, she talks about how space is essential. Let me just start again. So in her text, what stood out for me and has influenced me about how I approach the curatorial was her insistence that as curators, we are always involved in space, that an essential reason for making exhibitions is to make space where the audience can see works of art and have an art experience. Jacob's projects, and I would add methods, encompass artistic, curatorial, public, and community practices, a form of art in public that explicitly deals with the history and the current realities of locations in which she works. And in the way that she works, everything is required to create space for artists to conceive and present art. So this was also really foundational in my curatorial methodology, the ways in which exhibitions must be relevant to the places in which we're making the work, which might sound not that revolutionary, but I feel like there was a time when exhibitions were made from people who weren't in the cities and had no context to it. And it just didn't resonate or wasn't significant for the people that were living there. And the other text that stood out for me, I have it here, Constructing the Spectacle of Culture in the Museum, so Ivan Karp and Fred Wilson. And this text really opened me up again to the possibility of the curatorial as literary, as able to construct new narratives and rewrite histories through exhibition making, through the positioning of artifacts and artworks, and the critique of institutions. So lastly, I'm left with this provocation by curator and writer Maria Lind. The curatorial, she says, the curatorial involves not just presenting, not just representing, but presenting and testing. It performs something here and now instead of merely mapping something from there and then. It is serious about addressing the query, what do we want to add to the world and why? So I would now like to invite Myung-Sun Kim to share her own provocations on your individual approaches to care within your practice, and then followed by Geneviève and Julia.
Thank you, Chiedza, for that very insightful and amazing intro as well. It's also something I don't get to really sit and think about curatorial methodologies, and it's so embodied that you just kind of do it. So it's really great that we can talk about it in this setting, and thanks for creating this space. Yeah. Maybe as I was thinking about this question, I was realizing more and more about myself in terms of where I come from. And I can only kind of see from where I'm coming from as an artist, and also my history. So I thought I'd share a little bit more about myself, that I, sorry. I have terrible allergies. I don't have COVID, so if I'm coughing, it's just allergies. Yeah, so I have done work both as a curator and an artist in theater, live art, film, video, and in visual art over the past 15 years or so, and 9 years more focused in a focused way in curating in all of these different mediums. The curatorial practice really began as a way to think together with other people on the ideas that I was already interested in, and experiment together. That wasn't necessarily disciplinary focused. And in some ways I was drawn to performing arts and film video because it was so collaborative in its kind of the nature of the medium was very collaborative, and to just experiment, try things out. And I think that's a little bit harder to do in visual art when it's exhibition focused, and perhaps this is why I'm very much in programming and curating, because every act is a movement and coming together and experimenting together. And part of that is my practice, both as an artist and curator, is really rooted in my own desire as a human being to want something different, a different way of being together with others, many of the projects I do are built over friendship and or starting past, present, and future over many years. And when we started to talk, Chiedza, you noted on kind of like the communities that I had brought together through a correlation program. And it was actually a reflection of, in part way, the multiplicity of the communities that I inhabit as well. It wasn't like entirety, but I think it was, all the things that all the conversations that I was having with friends and deep thinkers that I wanted to really move together with. And as a sculpture and object focused artist, I think there's aspect to understanding material, having a material knowledge and understanding that's embodied, that extends to how I might think about the ideas and in relation to how I should care for the work and the artist, and how we might come together and respond to these learnings in ways that might nourish us, movement to thrive, and give sustenance. I think of artists as a systems change leader who can think creatively around many limitations that are given, and reimagines institutional frameworks and how we might do things differently in a good way. And having experienced both ends as an artist and a curator in an administrative setting, I feel like I learned, being at both sides of ecology, I found that I was able to advocate better for the artists and their work, and mostly learn strategies over the years from the artists I was very much working with. Um, and this speaks to pay equity and with artists. And I'm kind of like, I think over the years I learned how much artists are one person organization. And as institutional curator, you're paid for that meeting, but artists aren't. So whether you have 2 meetings or 10 meetings, actually artists aren't necessarily like, it's really the generosity of the artist giving that time. And I think about that every time I ask for a meeting or how they might be stretched, and I wonder how I can support them better. And it's a constantly learning process that I feel that internally, or as an organization has to move as an organism as well, as you bring in these invite others into collaborative projects. So thinking about that, I'm also approaching projects in a kind of 3 words come to my mind every time I think about an idea and what that might look like. And it's actually from I'm an Octavia Butler fan. And it was actually the 3 words she had on her desk as she was writing. Action, struggle, goal. It's not that you will always win, but every iteration is an action towards a goal, and there's a struggle and you might fail, but it's the chance that you take to experiment and with possibilities of failure. It helps me to focus on intentions and what I want to gain out of it. And yeah, I think that that helps me really stay focused on why it is and who should come together. And I thought maybe since you mentioned correlations, and it's been sort of my life for several years there, maybe a year and a half there, leading up to it. I would maybe kind of point out a few things. And I still think about different ways of it. I was thinking about mycelial network, and it became very core ethos of how we were approaching programming. And mycelial network, as I was learning, I've been in Toronto for 20 years, 19 years at the time, and I hadn't actually known a lot of the hidden histories, particularly Indigenous contexts that Angela Loft had brought forward. And this wasn't a common knowledge at the time, and there wasn't really traces that you could find very easily. And learning all of this and different stories I was hearing about living in Toronto specifically in relation to I guess the way things, the infrastructure of the city, perhaps. And as I was learning, it made me kind of think about my own impact as a physical body on the land, where the feet meets the ground, and what is beneath that, and all the hidden stories beneath that. It made me think about mycelial network as a way to think about how we might learn from it as well. Mycelial network is like a fungal network that extends, it could extend to forest, and mushroom is like the spreading fruit of that network. But they're like the fast internet system where if something gets cut or in danger at one part of that network, it will send message to the rest of the network, and they will produce this like toxicity so that they protect themselves and things like that. So I thought it was kind of this like symbiotic relationship, also taking from the dead and giving it back to the living as well, connecting like this different timelines. So and I think this is something that I've been thinking about, these cosmological connections of mycelial network maybe during the pandemic particularly, and the act of letting things die. And I think that's a really letting things die with care and giving palliative care to systems that doesn't work. And I think we've seen a lot of that over the pandemic. Yeah, so I wanted to, maybe coming back to the correlation, I wanted to think about it in relation to have that as a constant reminder and a host for all of our programs. So we commissioned Kaylin Taguibao, who's a gardener, who's a gardener, illustrator, and community worker. She had the mycelial network throughout. It's called Flourish and Unfold, where these new lives begin from the ruins of modernity. So yeah, it was a constant reminder, which I felt like it was really generously, literally enveloping all of us to be able to be present with each other. When I think about curatorial methodology, I also often think of Gendai Gallery. For the past 10 years. I've been involved in different capacities as an artist, but also in the program committee in some way. How they work is quite beautiful as a collective through long-term friendships, and it's really friends spending time together and moving in different ways. It's a shared platform that allows the function of the public art gallery to be really determined by the need of the moment, and whatever that might be, instead of the other way around. And it's a living model and responsiveness that's embedded. One of the work they commissioned, curated by Yan Wu wrote the text, but it was Yan Lau who curated. Alexander David, who's a Montreal-based artist, had a mobile unit. And it was a really thoughtful in the way they did it, because it's a storage unit, it's a shelving unit, it's a presentation model. We even had a campfire around it. So they were generously, and it's evolved over time. It was at OCAD at one point, and it was at the Biennial, hosting us through all of the events that we had. But it was also I wanted to think about them. I wanted to think about Maiko, Emily, Chris, Suing, like all the really incredible people who've been involved over more than a decade with Gendai Gallery, in thinking about how I might move with them in the space through the work. For me, kind of this space making and carving out the space is also like, there's a care in the ritual of returning. There's a care in the practice of returning to the work in this space, to have a long-term commitment. And Elwood Jimmy puts it in a way that it's like actually ethical, and like moving away from this model of a project focused. And I think about that, and I think about how this care and ritual. So how does that kind of exist in the way that we might do things differently, moving away, and particularly in this time? And how do we spend time together? And I feel like, I don't know if other people feel this way, but partly because we've been apart for so long, I think partly we're learning how to be a human again and unlearning what we did. And it just, I think about what that might look like. So I'm thinking about, models, different models altogether, and what might give, like what might be really generative and generous. And I imagine humans are very complicated, and we live in an even more complicated world than pre-pandemic, I feel. And I wonder, this act of returning is also very complicated because it's also a commitment to go through all the conflicts together as well. And I think about that, actually, I look towards transformative justice model, where it's actually community justice and it's understanding of the ecology, in that those people, everyone is in the conversation. So if you were to like describe someone as having done the harm, and the ones that are experiencing the harm, all be at the table and we change together and transform together. And this coming back to the table and an act of spending time together, I think about like what vessels might kind of guide us in a good way in this, in learning how to be, or unlearning and learning again how to be a human together. So maybe I'll just pause there, and I'm very curious to hear what other people will share. Thank you.
Thanks, Myung-Sun. Thank you for those really full ideas. I think what really resonated for me especially was, well, there was a lot, but the ideas of generosity and generating, and the interconnectedness within the ways that you're working, and the friendships, the mycelial, and the ways that they're all tied in intimately. So thank you for that. We'll talk more about it, of course, but I'll pass it on to Geneviève. Geneviève, if you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Very happy to be here. It's a pleasure to listen, listening actively and taking notes and thinking through with all of you. Being a curator. I think in the talks that I've been doing lately, I'm always like, I didn't think that's what I would be doing. I did not know it was a job. I just like stumbled into it. I thought I would be a designer. And it's strange, but it's also something that I'm just like, I don't think I can do anything else. I was talking with a friend last week, and I was like, what would I be doing if like this was not like a career option, and I would like leave fashion and not knowing that this was a thing? Like, I actually have no idea. I was thinking maybe a librarian, or maybe I would be like administrative assistant. I was like, I don't even know what are jobs. Anyway. So basically curating now is like, I'm like, this is my life. I love it. And so I was thinking lately about like, we were thinking about methodologies, and then I realized that basically since the beginning, I think that like conversations have been basically my primary method. So conversing with people and then thinking through ideas. And I always invite people to like use me as a sounding board. I just love brainstorming. And I think so many precious ideas and knowledge transfer like happens within like informal conversations. And then I guess when I understood like a bit more about curating, it was through an art history like class during my BFA that was basically just titled like Art and the Museums. And then, you know, my dad worked as a security guard like at the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal for a few years. And um, although he didn't end up staying there for as long as he wanted to, it was basically his favorite job. And then he would talk to me about like the people he meets and how he was not supposed to talk to visitors, but he couldn't help but talking to visitors. So because he wanted to know how they felt about the work. And then I think, yeah, I think art and some discussions about art have been around, but I never really understood what a museum was and what it stood for, and the narratives that were in there, and how like the conversations of the work and you know the gatherings and the priorities of museums and how they were funded. Like all of this was like, I just knew that like there was not a lot of people like me who like represented except in more informal settings, like I guess like cultural centers, because I did not even know about galleries or artisan centers. For me, it was like big museum or like the room next to the library. Like for me, that these were like the spaces of art. And yeah, and so I think when I had that class, I was like, oh my God, like I was basically mind blown. And I thought, and we talked about value. And there was this class specifically that I remember like was very kind of, I think that's where we like really collectively like understood like how some work would devalued like because of, you know, colonial realities and so forth. And we were asked to put a price on art. Like there were slides, and then we would vote on like how much this worth. And it was a very interesting process. And I think that's what kind of like I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about the function of museums and what it meant. And I think like through that, my understanding also changed, and my understanding of curation changed. And I think it's really interesting because right now we're talking a lot about curatorial practice as like a relational and embodied kind of like role and method. But not so far ago when doing my MFA, we were actually like, there was like two type of, I guess, curators in my class. They were people who were like, yeah, when you're a curator, you are there, yes, to take care of the object, but there was more of less of a collective way of engaging, more of a kind of okay, I don't know how to say that word, pyramidal way of functioning. Basically, you're telling, you know, you have this vision and the artist is there to manifest this vision for you in a way that is not really a conversation, but more of a, you have been chosen to do this. And there was not a lot of flexibility. And then there was like another part of the class, I was like, well, what if we could engage with artists in other ways? And I find it interesting because that's only like, it's what, 6 years ago that I finished my master's. So it hasn't been a really long time, but I think like right now, like even like curatorial in itself, like we talked about like the definition in the 14th century, and then like it just in the last 6 years, like it really changed, even the language, and thinking through like horizontality and like what that means, and caring for the artist and what that means. And also we don't put out there like how to care for curators, because I think this is a conversation that is not really out there, and I think it's needed to be there, especially if you're a guest curator. As a guest curator, yes, you are paid, and in many ways you're also paid more than the artist. However, a lot of exactly like meetings and all of that is never really part of your fee. And then your fee is also kind of like, it's a bit random, like it depends of the institution's budget, and And then you kind of have to make choices at one point. You're like, okay, I'll do this for this kind of money because I'm in this place that has less money, but I really believe in this, in this project, and I really want to do it. And you always have those choices to do it, and you're sandwiched between like the institution's desires and like protecting and like caring for the artists. And I think that's something we don't really talk a lot about. And I think like I wanna have conversations about how to care for curators as well, because there's a lot of invisible labor, there's a lot of emotional labor and output out there, and especially for exactly when choosing the route of being it like a relational a relational practice. And so for me, I guess like I don't want to take too much time because I'm looking at the time, but I think curatorial practice is relational archiving as well. I am a person, so, you know, in my family, there's history of dementia and Alzheimer. And I also am someone who had a mild concussion as a teenager. But I always been like compulsively like gathering little objects or memorabilia or pictures, or I always had this fear of forgetting. And I think in some ways that drives my practice, realizing that we're a lot of the time confronting to thinking that we have to reinvent some things or way of doings when actually it has been done before, but there's collective amnesia. And so for me, longevity is also part of that. It's remembering what people have been doing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and always putting that forward. I also realized that exhibition making is one of the special place where you can bridge the past, the present, and a possible future in one realm. It's a bit, I was like a time machine in some ways, and I really appreciate that about curating. And yeah, I think, yeah, like hauntings are also, I think, really part of curation as well, in different ways. It's always a bit like what has been taking a lot of space in your mind lately is part of it. And I love how there's like momentum in curating, how a lot of people are thinking about the same things at the same time. I don't think curating is about like innovation, but it's about entering a collective conversation. And there's always like these so people are suspicious about, you know, like if you are doing an exhibition and you're like, I want to talk about water, and then you're realizing a lot of people want to talk about water. Sometimes I hear people be like, oh, but a lot of people are doing the same thing. But I think it's better if everybody's doing the same thing at the same time, because there's room for like so many stories about this one thing, depending on where you're at and with who you're working with and who you are as a curator. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geneviève. Thank you for that. There's so much in there that I can't wait to touch on as well. So I'm just really thrilled. I think what really stood out for me too was the ways in which it sounds like your practice privileges the oral, like privileges oral wisdom, oral histories through conversation, which is really incredible. And then of course, where you just closed around collective thought is something that I think can really be stretched out and is a way of creating expansive ways of knowing. So not just keeping things closed in, but actually sharing them beyond institutions or individuals. So thank you. I'm going to invite Julia to speak, and then we will begin our conversation. But Julia.
Thank you. Maybe first I'll say that the idea of curatorial methodologies, I feel like has been on my mind for many years. And I think it's incredibly rare to have the space where we actually get to speak about them out loud in public with one another. And it really is a pleasure and a privilege to be in this space with all of you. So thank you for organizing, Chiedza. You know, in 2009, Chiedza, you mentioned Marie Lind. In 2009, I studied with Marie Lind. And at the time, she was particularly known for her concepts around the curatorial. And for Lind, curating, she sort of called curating as the craft. So the craft means you know how things are done. You know how to invite an artist to participate in a show. You pay them a fee. You know how to install their work professionally, write a text about it, and so on. Whereas the curatorial, she sort of spoke about this as kind of taking another step, taking this a step further, where the practice of the artist is considered in relationship to where that practice or artwork is shown, at what moment in time, the place it would be exhibited, the context of the institution it would be shown within, and also what is shown before or after it. And I mean, there's a whole kind of other list of things that Lynn talks about, but all of these create a constellation that has the potential to push things forward beyond the status quo. So in this kind of idea of the curatorial, it creates a space where the curatorial can be an agent of change, or at least an agent of possibility. And in 2017, Lynn resituates this definition of the curatorial, and she does this especially in the face of rising nationalist, authoritarian, fascist forces. And she's, at the time that she's doing this, she's working in Europe and had been there for about 11 or 12 years, working at Tensta Konstal in Sweden. And so she says at that time that as we're witnessing this around the world, it becomes time to intensify our focus on art with distinction. So not based on ideas around good taste, or even the idea of like a connoisseur, because we will always have various definitions of quality, and art's quality will always be, hotly debated. But rather focusing distinctions where we argue on our choices based on complexity, on relevance, and on urgency. So what she talks about is distinguishing inquiry from gesture, pertinence from entertainment, and uniqueness from routine. So I feel incredibly indebted to this methodology, and it's one that I have felt attuned to and have embodied in my work for many years, but I feel it really has come to fruition in my time at Mercer Union. Mercer Union is an artist-run center that was founded in 1979 for a group of artists. And I mean, I'm sure many of us know, but like artist-run centers were really created at this moment in history where we needed a space to operate precisely in between commercial galleries and large-scale institutions. Like there was really an imperative to form these kinds of spaces at this moment in time. And their intention was that they would show emerging practices, exhibit risk-taking and forward-thinking artworks, and what is maybe unique or what I am, find quite special with Mercer is that it's the kind of space that affords resources for artists to develop new projects. So they really were formed, these artist-run centers were formed as institutions that are in the service of artists and advocate specifically for them. And I think with that kind of a mandate, it allows for the curatorial to regularly consider what an artwork does and what an art practice does. And I think that these constellations of considerations or reference points are what underpin my own curatorial methodology. So at first, I used to speak about my methodology as something that was regularly taking up the question, why here and why now? But then my practice started to evolve, especially within the context of Mercer and with this history of artist-run centers in mind. The question now is, or the idea is now one that I call curatorial behavior, so that we consider running alongside what we show is how we behave. And I think that there are a number of elements that connect to curatorial behavior for me. At its core is being art and artist-centered. So it's not simply taking care of an artwork, but extending care to a practice for the artist, for the subject matter. And I think the ways that this can manifest is offering space rather than offering display, distributing tools and resources so that an artist determines what's going to be seen. And I often work as a commissioner. So I work very closely with an artist when they're making new work. So this then directly involves kind of building the scaffolding or the support structures that the artist requires in order to research, create the work, and then present the work. There's like all these kind of steps in advance of when the presentation actually happens. And then once that work is presented to a public, it's then about creating inroads to the ideas that underpin it and creating moments where thinking aligns in public or in semi-public spaces. And I think that this concept that I call curatorial behavior is markedly different in this way than large scale institutions, which have these learning education departments. And I think what distinguishes small scale spaces is that you move away from the idea of education or learning. And instead, an institution doesn't have to be an explanation machine. And we don't need to be the experts who are telling you what to think and how you ought to think it or why something is important. But instead, we can be intellectually stimulating, critical, thoughtful experiences when you're moving through our space and when you're encountering artworks. So institutions and the exhibitions they put forward can grow and evolve as the set of questions or any set of questions are discussed publicly and ideas are continuously fleshed out. So in curatorial behavior, we're not educating others, we're not experts, we're creating opportunities for sharing concerns, ideas between artworks, artists, cultural producers, publics. It really prioritizes, in my mind, debate and inquiry and a number of unexplored possibilities. I think in order to do this and uphold this idea of curatorial behavior, then it necessarily includes care for all of the bodies that will be impacted and influenced by our actions. So those bodies include the institution itself, those who work within it, attend it, visit it, exhibit within it, and are psychically invested in the activities of it. So working at a public institution, I am acutely aware of the privilege we have in occupying space, a certain kind of publicly visible space. And I think we've heard this many times, but galleries are not neutral. They are discursive systems of power with consequence tied to whom and what they include and exclude. So at its very best, art can cultivate and manifest the idea that everything can be different. And I think what's being asked of institutions at this moment in time is to consider ourselves within the role of that and not shielding the institution with artists and artworks, but actually making time for civic engagement and for behavior that's happening internally and externally. Maybe I'll just finish by saying that I think if within this idea of curatorial behavior, if we have the opportunity to consider that things can be different, then maybe the curatorial is imagining what that looks like or cultivating what that can look like. And I think the only time that we really fail is when we lack thought and connection. And when we forget to enact, I guess, good behavior, using the language that we kind of talk about at Mercer. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you so much. I think that's such a really great place for us to land as we begin to think about the following question, but I also just really appreciate the distinctions that you're making there around curatorial behavior and I guess the accountability that's required from the folks that are creating exhibitions to the public, but also to the artists and the makers. I think that's something that is new for me in terms of how you framed it and something that I'll be thinking about for quite some time. And then also the ideas of urgency. So exhibition making based on what is urgent and what is needed, which is something that I got from what you were saying as well. Yeah, so thank you for that. And so I wanted to dive into, I guess, the central question, following your provocations and what you've offered and the ideas that you've offered. And I also just want to say halfway through, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, because I just feel like it's so timely, but also really important to think about process and not just about products. I think it's quite rare that as curators and as makers and as arts workers, we get time to think about why we're doing what we're doing and how we got to where we are, especially with the ways that things have been during this pandemic and the distractions and everything else. It's I think it's just a really nice time for us to stop and pause. So I'm really grateful for that and for your presence here. So I just kind of wanted to open it up to Myung-Sun, Geneviève, Julia. This question is at the crux of this conversation about how might curatorial methodologies embedded in care contribute to creating a healthier society in these times. So having looked at, some of the foundational texts and exhibitions, inspirations, as a way of answering this question that the contingencies of care, residency, and residents are also thinking about. So I'm just going to open that question up.
There was something, Geneviève, that you were talking about when you were in school about how there were these kind of, correct me if I'm phrasing this or repeating it incorrectly, but that there were almost like two schools of thought, or like two ways that people were thinking about curating. And it also really resonated for me in my own experience, I think, working within institutions and also working and also studying, where there was like this idea that the role of the curator is to have an idea and to like rein in artworks in order to prove a point and like move through a space in order to have an argument, and that those artworks were like used, quote unquote, in order to make that argument clear. And I think when I was I mean, I don't know if this resonates for you too, but when I would hear about that, or when I would learn about that in school, I was like, that's just so the opposite of the way that I would like to work in my own methodology. And like, what does it mean actually if you're just really prioritizing the conversation with the artists and the people around the table in order to develop what something's going to be, rather than trying to prove or argue a point?
Yeah, and it's also very interesting because it also manifested in the kind of like the teachings. So even in the teachers, you would have that division of what curator, like, yeah, like what it means to be a curator. And so I did have a teacher that I strongly disagree with often, or question what he was putting forward, because I did not agree about what he thought the exhibition space could do and its potential, especially in terms of like new world makings. But also, like, it's important to me to be also transparent that like the person, like, although I had ideas about curating, while studying, and my own understanding of being a curator, like, has changed also over time, over relationships as well. And I think it's important to note that, when you arrive to the field, you are thinking that maybe you have an idea of how to function and relate, but it really changes over time. And so I guess for me, like, the question I also like wanted to explore is how care has evolved for you, like, throughout the practice. And I think, when I started again, transparency and vulnerability was, I wanted to inject more of that in my practice, but I did not know how. I also really felt that like Toronto is not a good space for failure. It really felt like you had to have it, like it had to be good at the first try. And at everything, meeting people, first impression, the projects you're doing. And I was very stressed about failing. Like, but that's also something, like, I think everybody's stressed about failing in many ways, right? We are also in a competitive capitalist world, and therefore failing is not really an option, or, has repercussions. But I think I was very, in some ways, guarded, and I was very scared when I started. And I think in terms of that, I love the way you put it in terms of curatorial behavior. I think in terms of that, I have been clumsy in some of my relationships. And so understanding from that as well, like how this fear of failing can have repercussions on how you relate to people. And then I think like going from there after that, like trying to always like through each project, because each projects you are working with different, well, not always. I think that's also part of something that I'm doing now, which is like not being ashamed or feeling like I should not working with the same people, because if it's about relationships and caring, you should be working with, you know, people more than once, instead of abiding to this cycle of because you have to renew or put something new out there, it means that you cannot work with the same people, and therefore like making artists also like disposable, and you also feeling disposable if you're a guest curator as a new addition. So yeah, and so like you're always in a moment that like you think you're ready for this next curatorial gig, but you're never ready, because you're always building new relationships or building on the relationships that you already have. But as to people who are also navigating different things, you have to like meet where you're at. So yeah, how did care evolve in your practice?
I'll go. I think for me, one thing that comes up just from what you're saying is the ways in which initially for me in my curatorial practice, it was about working with people that were in my community, and I was working with folks at Sunset Service, but also doing work with the rites of passage process. So working with youth of African descent who may or may not have been artists, but with whom like the arts-based methods were applicable. And I was really invested in introducing them to spaces, so bringing them to art institutions, and giving them a new way of like looking at these spaces, rather than the ways that they might have been shown by other folks. And I thought that was how I was contributing. And now more recently, it's been about what you're talking about in terms of these ongoing relationships, and how do I bring in my existing relationships into the projects that I'm doing. And I think I've also felt the same push and pull of the necessity to bring in new artists, new work, shiny capitalism, but then also to how do I honor the existing relationships. And I think Myung-Sun, you've done this so well. Again, I talk about correlations because I just think you really brought your community in ways that were meaningful, that were relevant. And for some of them, I remember like you had been working with folks for like 10 years. You know, in various ways. And I think as curators who now don't have collections in the way that the original definition is, I wonder if perhaps the equivalent of these collections that we would have taken care of in the, I don't know, 1920s for decades are these relationships. Those are the things that we're now charged with building, maintaining, taking care of, and ensuring that they are held. You know, so that's something that's there for me in terms of thinking about care. And as curators who are freelance or, you know, just don't have collections, I think that the care has shifted into this relational kind of way of doing things. So that's that on that for me for now. But that's a great question, Jen. So we can continue from there.
Myung-Sun, I want to hear about your relationships. I want to hear about mycelium. I want to hear it all.
This has been so great and very generative. And I'm just thinking about so many different things also at the same time. Yeah, I see even for like collection focused galleries to shift away from object-based ethos to really hospitality and relation focused. And that's really hard to do for, you know, major art institutions to shift in this radical way. And it's in some way when you're like smaller, maybe it's like to shift to human relations is not perhaps like well to think about that we should care for those people who we work with and the objects. But so right now I'm also thinking about just Agnes Etherington Art Center, since Emily Shanker's been there, and they have over 17,000 items in the collection, which they're now in the process of kind of wrapping up as they go into the major rebuild. And I'm also just thinking about how, you know, they're bringing back idea of hospitality and Kingston as a retreat. And I was recently in Kingston because I have some friends there as well, and it's so it's such an intense, I had such an intense experience because it's so institutionalized, the presence of military, presence of the biggest penitentiary in the country, presence of Queen's University, and those are the three things that I just saw, but also like incredible beautiful waterfront only in parts of Kingston. And so anyway, I'm thinking of that often, partly because I'm also working on a project for next year. But yeah, I wonder the complexities of bringing care to changing this major ethos. I also remember many of us were, I think, Geneviève, you were involved also at the AGO project together, the Every Now Then show, because Younger Than Beyonce was part of. Yeah.
Yeah, Younger Than Beyonce was part of it, but I was not part of it.
Okay.
like depending on projects, some of us are like, sometimes it's all hands on deck, sometimes it's not. Yeah.
Okay. I did not know that. I thought it was like everyone. But I thought that was maybe that was like an example of shifting the ethos to human, because working with living artists is so different than working with like objects with in the collection. And something simple as just finding time to chat or dropping off work, or like small things become evidence of what a different ethos that is. And I wonder, yeah, anyway, I feel like I'm a little bit rambling because this has been such a generative conversation to think about. When I think about it, I do feel like a lot of what we're talking about is also thinking about different ethos of where art organization, or rather art organization as an organism, can shift and mold in ways that actually cares for all of us. And to your point, Geneviève, I do think there's a lot more conversation now that are happening around caring for the people who are actually doing the work, which is so important. Yeah, and it's with history of art deeply rooted in like history of white supremacy. It's going to take some time to undo, I feel. But I liked your point of this collectivity, and there's a power to like collective process and collective voice to in shifting those frameworks.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about these new conversations that are happening around contract making, and how many institutions are rethinking their contract. And I'm thinking like, if, you know, like the process of decolonizing is slow, but also like, are we interested in decolonizing museums since they're like fraught from the beginning, and like what is the future of museum, and all of that, all of these questions. But I feel like in a way that is like very active outside of advisory committees and panels and all of that it really has been thinking through the contracts and how these are kind of like can list new ways of caring for people, but also can be a space for guest curators or guest artists to also describe how they want to be treated. So I did talk about this when I was doing this talk with the art gallery, Vancouver Art Gallery, but I've been doing this exercise of writing a clause for myself. So it was at a time that I didn't have a contract for this project I was doing. So I built a contract for myself, and then I was thinking about, how do I want to be treated And so I listed that for myself. And I think it's a very interesting exercise to do, because I think we're all having an idea of things we, experiences that we've had that we don't like, that we didn't like, the things that we struggled with, or things that we also sometimes, like that conflict resolution that were very successful, or just flat out positive experiences. And now I'm doing the gesture of trying to always submit that clause in when I'm hired for a project. And it's been very interesting to do as a process. It's been very empowering as well. We're like, I want to be treated this way, and I want this to be in the contract. From our understanding so far, it's easier to do that if you are a contractor than when it's actually like you're having a job, a permanent job, and you're like, I actually want a clause of care in this permanent job position. It's actually very hard to do that, as I kind of discovered in discussions with some friends. But in going back to your question, Chiedza, I think that is like part of the answer of curatorial practice, and how this can be like make a maybe better futures is like the thinking about how we treat each other is not just professional, but it also transposes like in our lives. And so in doing that, it means that we're also better like caring with the people who are around us, and therefore we are enacting this like maybe like reciprocity chain that is kind of multiplying like mycelium. And so and we, if we can sometimes also like I don't think we grasp the way we interact with each other, or how sometimes it's actually very healing, and the kind of space that we're carving from one another. And so yeah, that and contracts and how we treat each other,
Thanks, Jen. Mycelial, that's definitely the word of the day, I think. As always.
It is like it's of an era, like water,
because there's so much wisdom.
There's so much. And I love it. Like, I'm not tired. We should not be tired.
And okay, so speaking of tired, and I'm gonna have maybe just a couple more minutes, I want to hear from Myung-Sun and Julia about maybe your ideas around what a healthier society looks like at this time. But I just wanted to say, speaking of tired, Jen, you have in one of your links the NAP ministry, and as we were talking, and Myung-Sun at one point you're like, I'm rambling, and I was like, no, like these conversations, I was reminded, and I think it was the first talk that happened, or maybe it wasn't even with the contingencies of care, but Bonaventure and Candace Hopkins, who's a curator at the Toronto Biennial, had a talk. And at some point in the talk, Bonaventure was saying, these conversations take time. They take time, they take processing, like they're not just going to happen in 90 minutes or 60 minutes. And so I think the rambling is part of the process, the figuring it out, the trying to recall names, because we're not encyclopedias or Google. I'm definitely not. I've had a brain injury, like it's not even possible. But I think that it's the dialogue that actually allows us to grow. So I appreciate the slowness. I appreciate the time that we're taking to have these conversations, to think through them. And I appreciate rest very much. I appreciate the NAP ministry and the work they're doing, because I think in the meantime, while we're waiting and building, and while people are working towards institutions taking care of curators and arts workers, that our work is to rest. Like that's how we can contribute and embed care into our practices, and maybe embed rest as some sort of methodology around like slowness and temporal resuscitation or something along those lines, And then another piece that stuck there for me around a healthier society is a shift in language. So the ways in which people have been shifting from decolonial to anti-colonial, the ways that we've been talking about degrowth, rather than anything otherwise, and what I had mentioned at the beginning with what Steve Lamb talked about when he said refusing, so using these notions of refusal, refusing to reproduce violence that limits care. So actually just being really clear about our positions through language, I think, is another way that care can be embedded, that care doesn't always have to be soft, though it can be firm. And so, yeah, I think that shift in language, but I'll let Julia and Myung-Sun just take on those last few moments around what does a healthier society look like at this time through curatorial methodologies, and then we'll continue and take your time, but yeah.
Maybe I'll just pick up on this idea around the contracting idea that you talked about, Geneviève, because I think that it really connects to institutional structures, which is so much, I think, where my head and methodologies have been at over the last few years. I think as my role as a curator has also shifted within the context that I work within, there are different folks that I am more accountable to in this current position than I was, for instance, in my previous position. So I am accountable to audiences, to publics, to my team, to a board, to artists in ways that has a different resonance, I think, for me at this moment than it did, you know, in my previous positions where I was part of a much larger kind of organization. And you know, my work was specifically on exhibitions and kind of focused within that work. So I think that structure has also changed what I think care looks like. I think at this moment, care has like so many different threads to it, but the ones that I think about are the institutional ones, because you know, there has been this organization long before me. There will be this organization long after me. So what are the changes that I can make at this organization at this moment in time that take care of the people around me now, but also can take care of the future people who will be there, and can also really make sure that this idea of caretaking for artists and artworks can also be folded into how this organization behaves and works in the future. It doesn't need to live with me as my curatorial methodology. It can be something that is like part of the ethos and the values of this center. So I think all of it feels very ambiguous at the moment. The way that I try to think about it with the team is maybe there are ways that we can put new contracts and policies and systems in place that take care of each other. Maybe there is a kind of code of care that we can share with artists before we begin our work with them, and ask them to understand like how it is that we intend to work with one another in our years of working together, and ask them to participate in that process with us as well. Are there ways that we can change the policies around how we take care of staff and how we do embed rest, you know, and rejuvenation in the work that we're doing? How do we take the lead of the people that we're working with when they say, I need more time, I need more space, I need more support? Like, I think these are like calls to institutions to really think about how you can embed this within your organization. Not everything needs to be policy driven, but I do think that having more structures in place in some of these small scale institutions would help kind of build a scaffolding for how an institution can behave and work that then can influence some of the larger scale spaces. But I do believe that like small scale institutions play a very critical role at this moment in time, because there is a kind of like trickle up effect that happens inevitably. It's like the small scale alternative avant-garde spaces do a ton of work. There's a ton of labor involved with it, and then it starts to shift and grow, and the culture and the ecology starts changing. So I feel while so many conversations are about collecting institutions, I'm like really interested in the conversations in the small spaces right now. So I think that's where I'm at.
Thanks for that, Julia, and Chiedza and Geneviève. Maybe for me, it's like inward outward approach in some way. I've been thinking a lot about maybe this connects in some way, because I think there's not just one tool, but so many different tools to approach this. And like one tool won't actually do. There'll be like, you need people with you you need so many different tools at different situations. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about was like we talked about embodied practice, but thinking of the physical body of what's happening internally in relation to everything that's happening. And you can think about that in like, if you were to think about organization or the psychology of the arts, not necessarily organization, but like the ecology of the arts as a living thing. And maybe this is like what I talk about this with like several different people, but trauma-informed practice approach and understanding to thinking about this practice, like curatorial practice, but also just practice within the arts and how we treat each other as just human beings in the world. So both like maybe, yeah, like I think I think about I've been reading a lot about like maybe it gets like a little bit too nerdy around neuropsychology behind what happens to your body when you feel a sense of belonging, and then all the social kind of intersectional approach to understanding the neuropsychology of like belonging. And it's really complex, and I'm like learning about what that might looks like, what that looks like. And it's fascinating how where pleasure and desire lies, and our entire being moving towards that, and what cost. So so anyway, I'm just, maybe it's maybe I'll leave it there, because I think there's so many different tools and so many different parts to the ecology that is, yeah, I find that really complicated. And if I start, this will go on for a very long time, I feel, but I would love to continue the conversation. One of the things that came up in a conversation with a friend was, can you imagine if the system is not designed to make everyone feel like they belong here? It's meant to not have like people like, in the body that I inhabit, necessarily not very habitable, hospitable in some way. And I think many of us feel that way in situations. Imagine if all of us felt like we belonged there, and then we had agency, and there was kind of this horizontal way of being that didn't have to necessarily deal with different political power dynamics. I think we'd be looking at a very different world, and I feel like we're gesturing, all of us having a conversation about this, gesturing towards that.
Yeah. Jen, I don't know if you want to say something else. I see your mic is on.
Yeah, one last thing.
Okay.
I think also like, because I was thinking about how a lot of people stumble into curating, and I think my intention has been a lot into like demystifying conversations about like knowledge about curating. So I something that I am really into is being in touch with emerging curators. I mean, I'm emerging myself also still. I think it's like an ongoing thing, but it's just to be like also very open about sharing like what you know, anything from what you've learned about like budgets to what you can ask, because like as you move through institutions, it means sometimes you show at different institutions that have different type of things that it can offer, and so that also opens your eyes of what you can access. And I think it's really important to like tell people about everything that you know. I think there's a lot of tendencies to be protective of your ideas or things that have not yet formed, or anything that like knowledge that you have gained through time. And that's something I think in terms of like what it means also care and care between curators is to, at any time that you have the occasion to support someone in their own initiatives by sharing what you know is also a way of taking care of each other. And I also want to think that like longevity and care is also manifesting in allowing ourselves to have different peaks in our careers. That like you can, that like that's something that can happen, we don't have to, because there's, especially for racialized folks and within all different intersectionalities that are not at the center of, well, hetero white supremacy. It's hard to imagine yourself outside of the success that you can have like in a present moment. And so a lot of people are pushed to capitalize on that moment and not really thinking through about like what it means to actually, spread that moment, or to maybe enjoy this moment now. And it's okay if like at one point you kind of disappear a bit, that you don't have to like sustain that, and that you can disappear and then you can like come back. Because who doesn't love a comeback or a second album when a band has disappeared for 10 years? So yeah, like that, we have time.
Thank you so much. That's such a wonderful place to finish. We have time. We have time. our time is up presently, but we have time. Like we have lots of time to do this work. I am incredibly grateful for Julia, from Myung-Sun, Geneviève, for the conversation that we've just had. I know we were all really looking forward to it, and I'm so glad that we've just had it, and I'm going to be thinking about it for quite some time. I think the closing points, especially around demystifying the process, is part of what we're trying to do here, as a way of perhaps thinking about the curatorial as collective, rather than in these closed doors. Jen, as you kind of talked about those two schools of thinking, right? And I think at the core, that's rooted in relationships. That's rooted in relationships and how we relate to one another, how we relate to objects and beyond. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for saying yes. Thank you so much for being here, and for being able to sit. I will be releasing the ancestors as soon as we finish and pouring them into the earth, and thanking them for sitting with us as well and giving us space to think and feel. And of course, thank you to the Contingencies of Care organizing team, the RAs, and everyone else who's helped to make this possible. So that's it for me. Have a nice day. Anything else you want to say? I see there's some lovely things in the chat, so feel free to stay on and read them, because that's fine. Thank you.